Hello again. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, good night, uh, whatever the case may be for you. We're back again with another devotional, and I think this is the last week of devotionals for the interns. Um, so I hope you've enjoyed us sharing what God has put on our hearts, and hopefully some of it has been encouraging, and hopefully some of it has been challenging for you. Something that you can take with you and apply to your life, because I love things that are not only just inspiring to us, but that also challenges us and gives us something to apply to our life and something to work on when it comes to our relationship with Christ. But today, the devotion comes from Romans chapter 12, verse 3. And Paul writes, "For by the grace given to me, as I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober mind, with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." So really just the theme of I guess the last devotional for me would be humility. Something we all, I think, struggle with from time to time, because pride is just our natural self, just our fleshly desires. We're very prideful in ourselves and what we can think we can do. However, regardless of that, we are to think less of ourselves. And Paul says in verse 3 that, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." Wise men want to be humble, and yet, ironically, the first lesson we learn in the pursuit of humility is that it's not something we can just up and do. The first step in seeking humility is a humbling one. Humility begins with God's initiative and not ours. However, though, even though self-humbling is beyond our control, God does give us the dignity of participating in that process, and the opportunity to prepare our hearts to be humbled, as Paul writes in Romans 12:3, which is one of the most important words in the Bible about humility. It gives us a glimpse into the kind of heart that is ready to receive God's humbling hand whenever it falls. Also, C.S. Lewis memorably observed that humility does not mean thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. That's one of the famous quotes from C.S. Lewis that I've always remembered, and it's stuck with me even to this day. But more than just guarding against swollen views of self, the Apostle Paul would have us think with sober judgment, as he writes again in verse 3, which I take to mean, among other things, don't spend a great deal of time thinking about yourself at all. Yet self-awareness is mercy. Even if Paul would caution us against self-focus, what might it mean then as a Christian to think with sober judgment about self? So it's a question I ask that I have for you as well. You can answer, I guess, in your own time, is what it might mean for us as Christians to think with sober judgment, about ourselves. And as we look at the world, we see pride and self-interest and self-righteousness everywhere we look. It's a world that is swollen with inflated views of self. We cannot take, our bearings from our surroundings and at the same time cultivate sober judgment on ourselves. It's in the verse before, before Romans 12:3, that Paul says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." And Paul says this in Romans 12, verse 2, right before he says, "Think with sober judgment." From the beginning, from humanity's very first sin with Adam and Eve, with the original sin, we have been overestimating ourselves. And as sin, the great deadly rebellious impulse in the heart of the creature to overestimate self in the face of God, as sin has taken root and grown and spread and borne fruit in our world, one age after another has sought to outdo the others in self-regard. Maybe modern humans are no more swollen with self-regard than our ancestors, but we didn't have a bigger box of powerful digital tools for going into all the world and preaching ourselves. It's in the air and on our screens. If we look at the world around us for our balance, we will soar in self-exaltation or soon crash in self-pity. We need to get the bearings before the face of God, with hearts daily and weekly recalibrated by the rhythms of God, conscience, worship, and devotion. For most of us, the outworking of genuine humility before God also will include owning our proneness to overestimate ourselves. Humility may feel like underestimating self because our age is so bent on overestimating. The goal is not to underestimate ourselves, though, but to think with sober judgment in a generation inebriated with self. So that's kind of the devotion I have for you today is how will you, go from this and to not really think less of yourself because, we're God's children, but to think of yourself less, which I think then opens us up to really and truly the knowledge and the will of God. It's, it gives us a better understanding of that if, we're not always thinking of ourselves, at every moment in our self-righteousness and our self-interest and our desires, but at every moment, our hearts are turned to God. It's not until God has, and that His Holy Spirit has done a work in us to, rid us of our self-interest and our self-righteousness and our desires that we can become fully, known, like just fully know His will and, to better understand His will for us and the knowledge that He has for us. So that's the devotion I have for you guys today. Again, thank you for watching these devotionals that me and the rest of the interns have put out for you guys. I hope they've been encouraging and challenging. It's also super exciting that June 7th that we are finally beginning, going back to normal service of worship, being able to go back inside and worship together in the sanctuary. It's a big deal, and we should be praising and thanking God for keeping us safe, and we should continue to pray through this because not every church is being able to do this, and not every state and area are able to come back together. Thank you guys, and go in the grace and peace of Christ.